Hello everyone, good morning. Welcome to the introductory session of the Consumer Protection Act under the law of torts. Let's get started with the Consumer Protection Act 1986. In the current slides, we shall be looking into the introduction, the need, the Indian Constitution and Consumer Protection Act, the concept of the negligence under the Consumer Protection Act, certain important definitions, the Consumer Protection Councils and redressal agencies. Friends, then we shall be looking into the highlights of the Consumer Protection Act 2019 with certain general questions. Now, let's talk about the history and need of the Act. After independence, India was struggling very hard to attain the strong industrial base. While the situation was standing very still, the consumers of the country were facing many different issues such as alteration of the food, wrong weight, hazardous goods, etc., which happened and which hampered the interest of the consumers at large. Now, to maintain and keep up with the situation, a very strong need was felt for the legislation. And so, to maintain the interest of the people at large, this act was enacted. This act gave different concept, its definitions and certain establishment of the quasi-judicial bodies. They observed the principle of the natural justice to be maintained and protected, and on the basis of that the cases were decided. Thus, after the enactment, the difficulties which were faced by the unorganized sector of the society, that is the consumers, they started to getting resolved. Now, moving on to the next topic, it becomes very important to understand the basic principles on the basis of which this legislation was enacted, which are mentioned as the Indian Constitution. So our next topic of the discussion is Indian Constitution and Consumer Protection Act, its relevance and certain provisions. So as we all know that India is a democratic country and we strive to maintain the welfare of the state, which was envisaged upon us by the makers of our constitution. We have always tried to emphasize on the protection of the rights of its citizens. So it can be stated that the preamble of our constitution carries the basic idea of the protection of the interest of the people at large. Other than the preamble itself, there are certain provisions which directly or indirectly involves the issues to discuss the relevance of the Consumer Protection Act. Our constitution declares to provide social justice to its citizens and to promote the welfare of the people at large, which is a very primary duty of the state as mentioned under the Indian Constitution. Now, this social justice and duty of the state has been provided under Article 38 subclause 1, 39b and c. Moreover, the most discussed provision of our Constitution, Article 19, also talks about the relevant issues under Article 19(1)(g), which guarantees to all the citizens the right to practice any profession, and sometimes this article also empowers the state to impose certain reasonable restrictions under Article 19 subclause b whenever there is a need. Other than these provisions, Indian Constitution, there are other legislations such as the Indian Contract Act, the Sale of Goods Act, the Consumer Protection Act itself, which talks and which protects the interest of the citizens, and also it maintains the balance in the market, which is very much required to avoid the negligence on any part of the citizens. Now, when we have mentioned the word negligence, it becomes vital to discuss the meaning of the negligence and how this concept is relevant when we are talking about the Consumer Protection Act. So our next topic of the discussion becomes the concept of the negligence. Now friends, according to Dr. Winfield, negligence is a breach of the legal duty to take care which will result into the damages. Now, that means that if we dissect this definition, we can identify the three main elements of the definition. The first is duty to take reasonable care, under which the doctrine of foreseeability is discussed. Second is breach of that particular duty. And the third, damages which are result of that breach. Now, what is the relevance of the negligence when we are talking about the Consumer Protection Act? The negligence by any party will decide the liability of the party, and on the basis of the same, justice by the bodies can be provided. And so, it becomes particularly important that the negligence is identified and liability should be decided. There are other maxims where this negligence part is discussed or described somehow. One is buyers be aware and the second is sellers be aware. Now, these maxims will help us identify the negligence on the part of any of the parties. Now, when we are talking about the legislation, friends, we shall be knowing that every act is enacted with certain objectives of the same. So, every legislation has its own identified objectives which are to be carried on, and on the basis of that, the interpretations of that particular legislation shall be done by the justice providers. Now, there are four main identified objectives as you can see on the screen. The first one is ensure fair, competitive and responsible market that works very well for the consumers, and it also promotes ethical business practices. Now friends, what do you mean by ensure fair and competitive and responsible market? That means that it is the duty of the law, or rather the legislation, to make sure that a particular product in the market is being treated fairly, there is fair competition in the market with regard to the same product, so that a good environment is maintained and good ethical business practices are being carried forward. Now, moving on to the next objective. The next objective, as you can see on the screen, is to promote and protect the economic interest of the consumers. That means, my friends, that it becomes a vital duty of the legislation to make sure that the consumer's interest are protected. Now, what kind of interest? Interest with regard to the economic, or rather the interest at large also. Now, the third objective is to improve the next objective is to improve access to information that consumers require to make informed choices according to the individual's need. That means that information should be reached to the consumers, and now that becomes a very vital objective of this act. The next and the last one is to protect the consumers from hazard to their well-being and safety. That means, my friends, it is very important that no hazardous goods to be reached to the consumers at any point of time. Now friends, when we are talking about these objectives, it becomes very important that we think that what our government has done to protect, or rather to improve the access of the information. Now, we all shall be looking into the televisions, right my friends? So, have we ever come across this advertisement of Jago Grahak Jago? Yes. So, did you ever think that what is this advertisement for? It is a government initiative so that the consumers, or rather the television watchers, they can understand that it is their duty as the consumers to ask certain questions, and the duty of the sellers also to answer those queries. It becomes very vital, my friends, to understand that when the government is giving you the access to the informations, you utilize that access at the most. That will not hamper your interest. It will rather protect your interest, which is one of the objectives of the Act. Now, if we move on with the Act, we can say that the whole Act can be divided into three main parts. The first part is important definitions and relevant case laws. The second is consumer protection councils, and the third is consumer protection redressal agencies. Now, the consumer protection councils and the redressal agencies are called as the three-tier agencies and the councils. We shall be discussing the same concepts in depth in the later videos. So join me to discuss these issues in the next sessions. Till then, thank you very much, and I hope you have enjoyed the video.